education. Jack Stockwell at K-Talk Radio and on the stream. And the stream would be at youtube.com/Global Affairs Unfiltered. I invite you to join us there as our subscription list continues to grow. And my goal, of course, in the next 2 months is to have 1,000 subscribed. And the numbers continue to increase, and I appreciate that. On my health show, Breaking Health Barriers, we are almost at 1,000 subscriptions. Again, I really appreciate it. That's what makes me want to do this, obviously, is that we can reach more and more people because of the stuff, the stuff I heard on TV this morning. And I try to listen a few minutes to CNN, a few seconds at MSNBC, and a few minutes at Fox. And I don't even recognize Fox anymore. Just the absolute crap that was on Fox this morning regarding health, regarding world politics, and the news readers sitting on the Fox and Friends couch reading from a teleprompter. I guess they get paid an awful lot of money to do that, but I just cannot believe. Brian, I think, believes what he says. Some of the others, I'm not so sure they do. All right, so what gives me the right to say that? Because I do know what's going on, just as you do. Those of you who've been listening to K-Talk for a long time now, you know darn well what's going on out there. And just the crap this morning about measles, and this so-called expert they had on there about the deadly measles. Oh, for Pete's sake. They've got 2 deaths now that they've recorded, 2. And the question was asked, why the hesitancy for the measles vaccine? And she says, because a lot of people still believe in the false notion that there's a relationship between vaccines and autism, that she says has been disproved over and over again for the last 25 years. You know, that person may believe that, but they ought to at least show the alternative view, because the exact opposite has been proven. No mention of Bobby Kennedy, no mention of HHR. I listen to this stuff and I try to maintain some peaceable sense of purpose of what I'm doing. And I want to write it off to these are just, they're paid idiots. They're paid off idiots who I hope do not believe what they're saying. I'd rather they're being paid for hypocrisy than so-called experts being paid to say what they actually believe, when it's the exact opposite of what's been proven over and over again. Maybe I'll have time tomorrow on the health show. Forgive me for not being here. Yesterday I was under the weather. And it's interesting, whenever something hits me, that hits me in my sinuses, my throat. Fortunately, it happens on 3-day weekends. In all honesty, I've had too many sweets over the last month. Just too many sweets. And it suppresses the immune response. Probably the greatest danger of processed sugar, whether you're getting it in your breakfast cereal or your yogurt or your bagels or your office candies or treats or pastries or however your soft drinks, however you're getting it. We know through very reliable research, sugar, not only does it age you, I mean, look at me. You'd hardly, in my image here on the stream, you'd hardly believe I'm only 49, huh? But it suppresses the immune response. Something called the vagocytic test that they can do in a hospital to show how it absolutely puts your white blood cells to sleep. Sugar does. And that's what happened to me. And though I was recovering as of yesterday, I don't think I could have gone 2 hours. Of just too weak overall. This morning, I hope I can go 2 hours for the K-Talk crowd. My green screen's supposed to be delivered this week, and I'm changing location for my broadcast to another room that needs to be set up. But I might be able to get it set up here behind me, and so that I keep all that light flashing around my beautiful white hair will stop. All right, it is Tuesday, and it's a time for a political update, of which we've got a ton of stuff to talk about since last Tuesday. The Memorial Day sale for all of our products at ForbiddenDoctor.com ends tonight. It's a 15% off of everything regarding nutrition, including Forbidden Doctor products. And the sale will end tonight at midnight. You do not need a code. It's automatic. You do not have to be a member of Forbidden Doctor. You just listening to this show qualifies you for a 15%. You won't find cheaper prices. I guarantee you cannot find cheaper prices for standard processed products or mine than is going on in the sale right now at ForbiddenDoctor.com. And then, which of course includes ageless thyroid. Oh, I wanted to show the stream crowd here what I took this morning as far as supplements are concerned. And it constitutes my breakfast. I mean, there is so much stuff I take for my lungs, my brain, my thyroid, my kidneys, my liver, my digestive system, my nervous system, my immune system. And as long as I stay away from sugar, I feel pretty good. So I think we can get going here. There is a ton of information that I want to go over with you. The title of this show is Putin, or Trump calls Putin crazy. And you probably heard that in the news recently, which again puts me in a bit of a dilemma trying to figure out who Trump works for. Now, since May 20th, a week ago, the number of, and I'm going to explain where this blast on Kyiv came from, this recent one that was initiated by Russia. Since May 20th, I guess that's a week ago, the number of drones launched by the Ukrainian army into the Donbass and into Russian territory has almost doubled. The Russian authorities report 788 drone and missiles targeting Russian territory, not just the Donbass, but the actual Russian territory from Belgorod in, which struck victims among the civilian population, of course. And then a Russian Foreign Ministry statement, those attacks, quote, were carried out in an attempt to thwart direct Russia-Ukraine talks facilitated by the U.S. administration, which are designed to settle the conflict definitively. They also appear intended to derail the implementation of initial agreements reached in Istanbul on 16 May, including a massive prisoner exchange. So in a press conference 3 days later, Sergei Lavrov, a little more explicit, said this: "We believe these attacks are a direct result of the support provided by Ukrainian Nazis, primarily by a number of European countries, led by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the EU leadership." And then asked by journalists about the visit to Kyiv by Starmer and Macron and Merz and Callas, Lavrov said, "Those sustaining the Kyiv regime, including the figures you mentioned, don't conceal their role. It's not accidental that while we pursue a resolution via addressing the root causes of the conflict, they run amok, demanding an immediate ceasefire without preconditions. This stance allows them to continue flooding Kyiv with weapons. Their public statements indicate they're not prepared to change course, which only fuels the conflict and emboldens Zelensky and his team to carry on with their criminal activities. There certainly is a degree of European responsibility involved. I think that when the conflict is finally resolved and its outcomes are assessed, it will be difficult for those backing Kyiv to avoid accountability. So then he was asked, do you believe that the Western European leaders you mentioned are deliberately trying to thwart President Trump's mediation efforts in the Ukraine conflict? Could jealousy be a factor? He said, Lavrov said, I wouldn't say it's about jealousy. These leaders were simply more comfortable with the previous U.S. administration, which was leading the charge in the anti-Russia crusade and encouraged European countries to follow suit. Now, with the new administration in the White House, it's clear that they were more comfortable under President Biden. Their main objective was to preserve Western unity in what they described as an effort to deliver a strategic defeat to Russia on the battlefield. If we take a closer look at the positions adopted by London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, the Baltic states, and Warsaw, we'll see that they have no way of abandoning their stated goal. They bet their reputations on drawing Europe into a war against Russia and using it as a pretext to militarize Europe. Massive investment will have been made to that end by 2030. Chancellor Friedrich Merz has openly stated his ambition to make Germany Europe's dominant military power with the largest conventional army. This is alarming news, and historical reminiscences are conjuring up a disquieting picture. Another possible motive behind their actions is that they still hope to use some people from the U.S. establishment to bring President Trump and his administration back into an anti-Russian camp and thereby share responsibility or even shift the blame. But I believe they won't succeed this time. And then shortly after this took place, you had the statement by President Trump talking about how Putin has gone crazy. Well, after all of these drone and missile launches into Russia, Russia did what Russia does. They respond in kind, actually heavier, as any of us would if we were under attack. And then President Trump, without saying anything of the provocation as to why Putin did what he did, just calls Putin crazy, like Putin's trying to upset the peace table talk. Well, you know, there's something about the human species that's different than any other species of life on this planet, especially mammalian life, because we are the creative species. The only one in the universe so far that we've run across that's creative. Yeah, I know there's some evidence of other creative intelligence out there, but until they show up on the White House lawn, it's difficult to credit a lot of that as to its source. Not that it's not happening, just to its source. But the human mind is a microcosm of the universe itself, even down to the quantum levels of creation. What the human mind is capable of creating outside of its own immediate corporeal existence, in the sense of creative energy. And we have within us this anti-entropic nature. We fight entropy. And our creative reason is capable of always finding a solution to whatever problem there is, to a higher plane of existence, to get us out of the mess and the horror and the pain that we're in. But some of us love our horror and pain. Some of us languish in it. Some of us can't find a creative way out of our pain. And when you have enough of those people come together, it makes up a community. And when you have enough of them, it makes up a larger community to the point where it ends up making up and becomes the basis of a culture. I need to blank out my boy, it's 20 after already? Blank out my microphone here while these commercials play at K-Talk. And so what I'm trying to say is that by mobilizing this potential power, this creative genius and power that our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has, there isn't a problem that our culture, that our planet, that our species suffers from that we cannot, using that creative genius, find a way out of it, as long as we stay safe of the banks and the money lenders. Now, it's obviously true that this present world that we're in now, and this is a part of our update. Well, let me finish the idea as to why Trump is calling Putin crazy. Is because Putin responded in kind to these 800 missiles and drones that were sent into Russia, most of which were shot down. Now, it doesn't matter that they were shot down in the sense that, well, since none of them got through, why worry about it? Because some of them did get through. And because some of them did get through, innocent Russian civilians were killed. And Putin is going to do the same thing that any leader of his country would do under similar circumstances if their citizens are being killed by a foreign power bent on their destruction. He answered. And he answered the way that the Department of Defense in Russia wanted that to be answered. And then Trump, who I still wonder who he's working for. I thought he was an autonomous, independent figure until I saw his sellout to Netanyahu. And I still want to believe in the art of the deal, and I still want to believe he is carrying out his responsibilities as the President of the United States as a businessman, a patriotic, America First businessman, as opposed to some stinking politician. But he's getting a lot of bad advice. I heard Keith Kellogg this morning on the news, and I just shook my head. I mean, one has to say no eventually to any practical approach to politics. You have to start with a vision. And I think it's obviously true that the present world is in such a complete disarray. We've already come very close to regressing to a barbarous state by tolerating what's going on in Gaza, which has been termed even by the former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert. He just recently said what is going on in Gaza by the IDF is close to war crimes, if not war crimes. And the ongoing genocide, since long described by the International Court of Justice and lately even by Joseph Borrell of the European Union, and a toleration which has put just a horrible stain on all of humanity. Just talking to some people where I live about this over the weekend, just brief discussions that don't really go into any depth, but they've just been sold on this Israel first propaganda. When what is going on there now, and when I walk by this group of people, they always want to know my opinion because they think that I'm some great talk show host. Because I can usually, there's a couple of them that are influencing the rest. So I take on a couple of these just to show the illogic of their logic. But I got them to understand that what is taking place, even if they believe in Israel first, could easily lead to an all-out war in Southwest Asia and could easily escalate into global nuclear war. And then these recent developments around the Ukraine have revealed a rather amazing lineup showing up now. It's always good to know when you're going into some kind of a match who you're up against. Now, the two largest nuclear powers, the presidents of the U.S. and Russia, are attempting to find a peace agreement to end this war. about which every sane person should be happy, while some Europeans, especially those in the coalition of the willing, and at least Trump had some rather nasty things to say about them, are still trying to sabotage these efforts. To prolong the war, have not given up on the goal to enable, in their crazy belief that somehow Ukraine can win this war, even at a moment when the Ukrainian army and population cannot sustain this war of attrition much longer, with more than 1 million people dead. That's another thing they said on the news this morning. I forget which person said it. I think it might have been Kellogg. 1 million dead on both sides. Well, that's not true. There's 1 million casualties for sure on the Ukrainian side. I think the most liberal number I've heard about Russia is about 200,000, which is bad enough. And most of those fighting for the Russian side are volunteers, incidentally. So here you have the coalition of the willing trying to convince other European leaders and European nations to confront Russia without U.S. backing, because I think they see the writing on the wall, which I thought was writing on the wall, that eventually the U.S. is going to stop supporting the Ukraine war. But the Global Hawk drone down there on the western part of the Black Sea, doing heavy surveillance of the Crimea. And so you have this coalition of the willing, a far cry from being able to confront Russia without U.S. backing. And the European economies are absolutely collapsing because of all of this self-inflicted crisis. Everything from the exorbitant energy prices from blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, as well as all this ridiculous green energy investment the last 3 decades. And I mean, everything that was built up in Germany out of the rubble fields at the end of Second World War is now being dismantled. So the journalists and the analysts around the world are just asking with disbelief, what in the world is going on in Germany? What in the world is going on in Europe? Why are they ruining themselves? They let the Nord Stream pipeline be blown up. They've imposed sanctions on Russia, which have done nothing but backfire, which is making the Russian economy grow and ruining their own economy. Germany closes its nuclear power plants without having an alternative energy source that can deliver the same kilowattage. And only 80 years after World War II, Germany is now militarizing its economy again with a form of credit creation that echoes the old Mefo bills of Hallmar Schacht, just to put the German army close to the Russian border and to send German tanks against Russia again. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, Europe was seen as one of the best models of creative development productivity on the planet, with a top-end ratio of scientific and technological innovation and a resulting very, very competitive economy, a very high quality of life, high social standards, safe living conditions. And look at it now. I mean, Europe is about to be completely sidelined. They can't repair their infrastructure. The trains are never on time. And they let their hidden champions go bankrupt and invest abroad, not the least of which Volkswagen, most of the German auto industry now. And as I've told you before, there's one particular Volkswagen plant that is turning out now tanks instead of the people mobile. And they've let their social system be cut to pieces. Now, there's not an easy answer to this because it's very layered, multifaceted, many levels of brainwashing, many levels of simple backstabbing, of simple payoffs. nudging, I think is what they call it these days. And one set of layers starts with the geopolitical maneuvering, just as what rightly was termed the historic chance of German reunification. And it was sabotaged through the geopolitical maneuvers of the neocon in the Anglosphere, London, Washington, Wall Street, who from the very beginning had no intention of making good on the promises that were given to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and the Soviet leadership at the end of the Cold War, namely that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. Let Germany come back together in one country. We need the farmlands of the West to combine with the industry of the East to make Germany great again. And in return, NATO will not move 1 inch closer to the Russian-Ukrainian border. And if Germany was allowed to unify and join NATO, then they would not expand NATO beyond that. So the neocons were exuberant in their triumphalism that they had won the Cold War, arrogantly warning the words of Pope John Paul II, who said, "The structures of sin existed equally in the East as well as the West," and that one only had to take a look at the underdevelopment of the so-called Third World that was under the control of the West and the continuation of their neo-colonialism to find the proof of the structures of sin also existed in the West, which I thought was a very interesting thing for Pope John Paul II to say, because we always thought of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And what the Soviet Union did at the end of World War II and moving into Eastern Europe and taking one country after another till they put the Warsaw Pact nations together, including the splitting of Germany, as the centerpiece of evil, combined with Maoist China and the rudiments of Lenin and Stalin and the starvation of white Russians and the building up of the tyranny that was in the Soviet Union, and the throwing out or the failure to support Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese revolutions and supporting Mao and Mao Zedong and all the brains behind Mao, I'll think of it in a minute, as the epitome of evil. While we, of course, were the great white prince upon the great white horse with the great white flag of Christian righteousness. When in fact, as Pope John Paul II said, both sides are sinful. And without going into the sins of communism, which is rather apparent, he talked about neocolonialism and how the West, using slave labor in these mostly sub-Saharan African countries, as well as the Iberian stuff, the global South stuff, what was going on between Panama and the Rio Grande River, and those horrors, and the things that were going on in South America, that while Western media would talk horrible about what was going on with the global drug trade and the horrors of Venezuela, still supported by international banking. And I thought that was very clear that was pointed out. But then the West proceeded then, under the guise of being the saviors of mankind, the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And outlined the unipolar world and imagined that this would be the end of history, probably the shortest-lived 1,000-year fantasy ever, the same thing that Hitler wanted, a 1,000-year reign. The Third Reich was supposed to be there for 1,000 years. The Wolfowitz Doctrine creating a unipolar world with the U.S. military being the police force around the planet, and that's kind of what we are, would be another 1,000-year rule, where peace would eventually be established worldwide. Now remember, as I've said many times, a lot of these people do not define the word peace like you do, like I do. I define peace as an absence of strife. I define peace as beating your swords into plowshares. I define peace as following the Christian concept of doing unto others as you would have be done by. Peace to them, of course, means militaristic control of the rest of the planet so we can take their natural resources for the benefit of the West and put in some lackey government that will support us in doing so while the horrors in those countries continue. So we've ended up with a bankrupt neoliberal system. We've ended up with a bankrupt moral climate in the West that allows these things to continue, that allows genocide in the Gaza to continue, that our country is part and parcel right there with Netanyahu. And I've got some predictions I recently ran across of the number of babies that will starve to death in Gaza in the next 30 days. So there's dozens and dozens of government documents released in US, German, British, French archives, libraries about the countless number of assurances against eastward expansion of NATO that were given to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze by Baker, Bush Jr., Kohl, Gates, Mitterrand, Thatcher, John Major, Werner, and they also reveal that a membership in NATO for the Central and Eastern European states was rejected by many leading politicians. And the keynote speech by Foreign Minister Genscher at the Protestant Academy of Tutzing, January 31, 1990, the so-called Tutzing Formula, influenced a whole series of top meetings in the following days in which Gorbachev agreed to German unification, provided that NATO would not extend to the east. And Genscher said this: "We don't want unity at the expense of third parties. It's up to NATO to declare unmistakably, whatever happens in the Warsaw Pact, an extension of the NATO treaty to the east, a NATO territory to the east, that is, closer to the borders of the Soviet Union, will not happen." Well, it's interesting that that speech has disappeared from the internet. Can only be found, you have to go dark to get it. So in a memorandum of February 9 about the discussion between U.S. Secretary James Baker and Shevardnadze, Baker is quoted clearly saying, "There would, of course, have to be ironclad guarantees that NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward." Excuse me, I still have some congestion in my throat. It was nice to have a rest for the last 3 days, but I've got a huge schedule today in the clinic. And I debated whether to do this morning or not because I didn't want to lose my voice. But the chances to establish a new international peace order, or a common European house, as Gorbachev called it, first with the program called the Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. Then later the disintegration of the Soviet Union to the European, or the Eurasian land bridge, to connect essentially Paris with Beijing. You know, if one considers the fact at that moment, it was only 45 years after the end of World War II, in which the Soviet Union had lost 27 million citizens of in its war against the National Socialists. And the Russians demonstrated an enormous generosity in allowing German unification, or even agreeing that the unified Germany would be part of NATO. I mean, just think about that. Only 45 years prior, when the Red Army moved into Berlin, took over the Reichstag, hung the hammer sickle over the top of the Reichstag before they blew it up. 45 years later, Russia is agreeing to let East and West Germany come back together after they had lost 27 million of their population, in a belief that some kind of peace could be established. And in light of these promises, the breach in trust was felt all the deeper. I mean, if one considers that there was also the unilateral cancellation of all the arms control agreements by the West, from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the INF, the open sky, the other treaties, the admission by Merkel and Hollande that they only agreed to Minsk II in order to gain time for Ukraine to be trained up to a NATO level. I mean, one can clearly see that the obligation to fulfill that promise is on the part of the West. And then you have to remember, I talked about this 2 months ago when it happened, the big expose that was in the New York Times, based on 300 interviews as part of a year-long investigation which revealed that the U.S. headquarters of the U.S. Army in Wiesbaden was, from the spring of 2022 onward, the command center for the war in the Ukraine, at a point when Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to sabotage the so-called Istanbul Agreement between Putin and Zelensky, giving in this way the ultimate proof that this war was not about the Ukraine. It's a proxy war between the U.S. and NATO on one side and Russia on the other. And so it's kind of a time for a sober assessment now of these last 35 years before the last red line is crossed, that we find a way out of this. I mean, you clearly remember from the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, 3 years ago, over 3 years ago now, the mantra in the West from Biden, from Scholz, from Macron, von der Leyen, Ukraine must win. Ukraine must win at all costs. Ukraine until the last Ukrainian. Ukraine must win. Russia must be ruined. And now, a little more than 3 years later, it's evident that the Ukraine, and therefore NATO, has lost this war. And that loss is just in line with a row of other losses: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and probably you should add Syria to it now, where the reformed, peace-loving al-Qaeda leader is the president. And that despite more than 800 military bases the U.S. has maintained in order to prop up the unipolar world and its dominant position on this planet. President Trump won the election for the second time because he promised to end these wars, to not start new ones. And there has to be some realization that the model of propping up the unipolar world through a system of over 800 military bases has utterly failed. So then, why is the European coalition of the willing, this group of European nations coming together to continue the war against Russia, if the United States indeed does pull out, why are they sticking to such a failed policy? I think it's obvious that they don't feel that they're in a community of values with the USA as a nation as such. But with this neoliberal system, actually, not that that America is a republic, but you've got America that's been subverted by the British Empire, based on the Anglo-American special relationship, with which Trump, having left that relationship on the table, did not break it up, remains completely loyal to the British Empire. And that system, of course, turns out to not be too liberal at all. So when Vice President Vance blamed the Europeans at the Munich Security Conference of having a degenerated sense of democracy, remember that. I think that was back in March. And that in the European Union, many notions were used that reminded him of the Soviet Union, such as disinformation, to discredit alternative opinions. The outcry to his comments there were absolutely deafening that he made there in Munich. But the case of Romania demonstrates that the European it demonstrates that the European Union lets countries vote as often as necessary to get the desired result. That's kind of what happens with parliamentarian governments. You can overthrow a parliamentarian government much faster than you can a Republican form of government that we have. Now, the recent case of depriving two German journalists, Thomas Roper and Alina Lipp, who are working in Russia de facto of their citizenship, has been compared to the Edict of Worms back in 1521 and the prescription of Martin Luther, who was equally deprived of all rights of citizenship. They're German journalists living in Russia, reporting on the news as they see it in Russia. And Germany has just removed their citizenship. They're no longer German citizens because they print stuff that the German government doesn't like. That's exactly what the German government at the time did to Martin Luther. They didn't like him questioning the Catholic Church. So they removed German citizenship for Martin Luther, born and raised in Germany. And so libraries in Germany now categorize books with a marker showing what the philosophical and political outlook of the author is, as if the library user would be too stupid to judge it for themselves, and indicating what is in its place politically correct. Just think about that. If we had that here, and we might be coming to that in this country, where your trip to the library, those small percentage of U.S. citizens who still utilize the library, and by that I mean just ask yourself that question: when's the last time you were in a local library? Well, I know some of you were in there all the time. But some of us may not so. But suppose you went into the library and maybe not the section about the history of art or the history of architecture or the deeper meaning of neurodegenerative disorders, but a section on politics, a section on economics. And the book had some kind of a color stamp on the front cover, letting you know in some form of censorship whether it was accepted, whether it has the outlook of the unipolar world and is in support of America's domination of the planet, or if the author indeed believes in a multipolar world and that America is one of many nations, not the only nation. Now, there's a completely different reality of the countries of the global south that are led by far the global majority of mankind now. And this is one of the scariest things about the BRICS. If not already, very shortly, the GDP of the BRICS nations is going to be larger than the GDP of the non-BRICS. And not only have they refused to accept, the global south, refused to accept the NATO narrative about the reasons for the Ukraine war, but they're inspired by the largest economic miracle in history, the one China has accomplished in the last 40 years, lifting 850 million people of its own citizens out of poverty. and providing with the Belt and Road Initiative a transmission belt to bring the accomplishments of China to the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Another thing that greatly threatens the unipolar world. And according to the critical technology tracker of the Australian Strategy Policy Institute, that I think it was about 2 weeks ago I talked about this, China is now leading in 57 of 64 advanced technologies. The U.S. is leading in 5 of them, incidentally. China is leading at 57. There are literally hundreds of Chinese citizens with several million inhabitants each, with enormous modern construction connected through a system of more than 42,000 kilometers of fast train connections, and a system larger than that of all the other countries put together. And these trains, unlike European trains, are on time. And it would require a whole presentation that I don't have time to get into in itself to do justice to the breathtaking success of this Chinese model of economy. And if the U.S. and the EU declare China to be a systemic rival, the collective West has already lost that race. And China still offers America, come and join us. Come and be a part of this technological revolution. You just have to quit being the policeman of the planet and allow the citizens of these various countries to decide for themselves what they want to do and the role that they want to play in the future of their nation, rather than threatening them with these economic hits, the confessions of an economic hitman, that kind of foreign policy. And then rather than studying the reasons for the success of the Chinese economic model, which is based on a continuous injection of innovation into the economy, which is the Chinese version of the American system of economy developed by Alexander Hamilton. Both the U.S. and the EU seem so far determined to engage in nothing more than just a new arms race on land, sea, air, and space. And at the very latest, since the historic memorandum between Presidents Xi and Putin on the 4th of February 2022, which consolidated the strategic partnership without limitations between the two, this strategic relationship between the strongest economy in the world, China, and the most technologically advanced nuclear power on the planet, Russia, with China catching up very fast, mind you, should have made clear to any strategist of any country that the shift to a multipolar world has been consolidated by a majority of nations on this planet. Which may be another reason that it's been rumored that Trump wants an end to this Ukrainian war so he can move everything over to the east and start a war with China, because of China's increasingly dominant role in strategic technological development of these other nations, where China is openly sharing what they have, especially in the areas of nuclear energy. Now, I heard a little blip on Fox 13 here the other day about the possibility of a small nuclear power plant down around Green River. And of course, you have to use a lot of water. You just about have to run a river through a nuclear power plant to keep it cool. And the United States, especially in the area of Green River, is not necessarily known for all of its oasis sources of water. So the citizens, and I can understand their viewpoint, don't want this thing built there because there's a lot of farming that takes place in that area that requires a lot of water. Yet, if that were to happen, and apparently Governor Cox is in favor of it, I'm certainly in favor of it, to build a nuclear power plant in America I think, if I remember correctly, I can't remember if it's 40 or 60 currently operating nuclear power plants in the country, none of which have blown up, mind you, over the last several decades. No new ones have been built, especially since 3 Mile Island. And yet nuclear power plants are just springing up like mushrooms after a heavy forest rainfall throughout the rest of the planet. And they're using thorium, they're using 4th generation French and Chinese power plants, small ones, because they get built quicker. They still put out a tremendous amount of power. And we're debating over whether to build one in the Green River area or not. Now, either we continue with geopolitical confrontations risking a global nuclear war in the end, which, of course, would end the worrisome notions of where our power is coming from, or we can mobilize with the wisdom of the conveners of the Peace of Westphalia, who recognized that after 150 years of continuous religious war in Europe, there would be no winner. And the continuation of the war, not only would there be no winner, there would be everybody dead. So in the first case, you can see an unprecedented arms race, including the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system envisioned by President Trump, which is to be ready in, 3 years? Which is a global, multi-level, multi-domain missile defense system that seeks a significant expansion to outer space-based combat capabilities, including the development and deployment of orbitable interception systems. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Which, of course, violates our principle of the Outer Space Treaty for the peaceful use of space, yet another arms control treaty. And it will for sure be answered by Russia and China and all the other major players like India. India's already sending a moon mission. And who was the other country talking about it? It just blew my, was it Vietnam? Some other country was talking about developing a missile to the moon from their perspective. All right, looks like the news is playing now at K-Talk. So in that same line of thinking, Europe, of course, is going to now complete militarization to try to build a European nuclear shield. And Germany says they are going to try to build up the strongest army in Europe. Now, as Pistorius, the defense minister, was saying, he wants Germany war ready by 2029. Merz, the new chancellor, although only by a string of majority votes in the Bundestag, wants to build up the strongest army in all of Europe. Enormous physical capacities are simply going to be wasted while the real economy and the social system inside Germany is simply going to get wiped out. And so it's very likely that none of these plans are ever going to come to fruition, because in the meantime, the completely overextended financial system continues to blow out. The U.S. debt crisis is on the edge, the verge, essentially, of detonating. NATO and NATO and the European Union will disintegrate. And all of Europe will experience an explosion of absolute civil unrest, which they're on the verge doing now because of their immigration policies. And if Germany does not before become a theater of war, in the case of Merz already secretly deploying the Taurus, and soon the new German-British long-range missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers into the Ukraine and other countries, What will be left of Europe when Russia decides it has to act on that? Will just be the fossils of a civilization that was so totally destroyed it never made it into the museums around the world because the rest of the world won't exist. Now, what is being suggested is a completely different approach. And this is what the Schiller Institute conference this last weekend was all about. To recognize that we have reached a point in universal history where a paradigm shift is needed, more fundamental than even the changes that started taking place in the Middle Ages in Europe to the modern age, which replaced the image of man and the conception of the physical universe from a dark age of superstition to the modern idea of the role of science and technology and the perfectibility of human culture. And so today, you kind of have to leave the geopolitical ambitions behind and proceed from the notion, and this is from Schiller, one humanity. And then put all the national interest and cohesion with that superseding concept. So that you have the United States sitting down, and the United Nations would be a good venue for this, sitting down with Chad on one side, the Sudan on the other, and Ecuador over here, and tiny little Lithuania over here, and you see one another as equals. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody fires a missile at you, you turn the other cheek. I don't mean that. All these countries maintaining their separate individual sovereignty, maintaining the control of their borders, maintaining their own defense capabilities, but working together in such a way that they're benefited by the business and the cultural transactions that take place between these countries in the tradition of Nicholas of Cusa, that harmony in the macrocosm is only possible if all the microcosms develop in the best possible way. It's just like the human body. The heart is no stronger than the weakest cells in that myocardium. The nervous system is no more healthy than the weakest neurons in the brain. But they all work together to raise each one up to the level of the expression of the maximum of what it means to be human. In a species, as I started this whole thing out talking about, that alone creates the creative power of genius. So a mobilization, and an issuance of a passionate appeal for the peaceful transformation to a new epoch in human history, where we can sit down in a confab with one another in these countries, starting off, how do you see the human species 100 years from now? And let me ask you that about our own government here, the United States. How do you view Congress 100 years from now? Will we have stopped being a bunch of squabbling little toddlers kicking each other in the shin bone? When we will have grown up in humanity where thermonuclear fusion energy will be commercially available to all nations, and so there will be no more wars over energy sources, over water. Pyrolysis, chemical recycling, biotechnical methods, gasification, plasmic arc processes, or in the future, the fusion torch process, will give us all limitless access to raw materials, so there's no more wars over access to raw material, no more slave nation state type of existence to the countries that do possess these things? Will we have built infrastructure in nearby space? Villages on the moon, cities on Mars? Will we have made any improvements in the next 100 years of the identity of one human family? And it just goes on. And on and on and on. So, since May 20, the number of drones launched by the Ukrainian army into Donbass and the Russian territory, as I said, has almost doubled. And what are we going to do? Well, you know, Russia responded as one might expect Russia to respond. And now Trump is calling Putin crazy. I just turned the mic back on for K-Talk after their news break. And I was just finishing up my projections for the next 100 years of mankind. But going back to the Trump-Putin discussion back on May 19, there are media reports trying to say that it wasn't successful and that now there's going to be a big standoff between Europe and the United States. But when you take a moment to understand the difference between what the Europeans are calling for and Zelensky calling for a ceasefire versus what Putin is calling for, what do you see? Well, it's very clear because this is going to be one of the big dynamics of this coming week. Here it is Tuesday, the 27th of May. June shows up this weekend. I think it's very clear that the Russian position is that they have set clear goals for what they called the special military operation. That is the protection of the Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine. They've almost succeeded in that by liberating the 4 oblasts. An oblast just means region, the 4 regions, and Crimea. They also demand that the root causes, which is not only the Russian speakers, but also that Ukraine must be neutral, that Ukraine cannot join NATO, and there can be no offensive weapons left in the Ukraine. Obviously, that is subsumed in the 2 earlier demands, but no offensive weapons will be stationed in the Ukraine. And I don't think there is anything in the world which will convince Putin and others in the Russian government to let that demand go by the wayside, because they regard that as absolute existential threat to the existence of the Russian Federation, and that's why this whole thing started in the first place. And since this was the demand by President Putin on December 17, 2021, 2 or 3 months before this SMO began, this was an appeal to NATO and to Biden to give legally binding guarantees for the security demands of Russia. And it was utterly disregarded, completely ignored. Biden made some blah, blah, blah answer by saying, yeah, we'll start arms negotiations, but didn't address the so-called core interest in the slightest, that NATO would not be, or that NATO would not be moving into Ukraine, and Ukraine had to demilitarize. And NATO, of course, made some kind of a similar non-answer. And that is why the whole conflict went into this special military operation, which, as many military experts have said, was never, ever meant to go into a full-fledged war. which you could judge by the size of the Russian army. There was only 190,000 soldiers who were amassed at the Ukrainian border against a Ukrainian army of 400,000. So whenever you hear these so-called experts saying, oh no, the Russian army was repelled by the Ukrainians, showing the weakness of the Russian military force, got their butts kicked, ran them back out of the Ukraine, all Putin, and he had misread the situation, was trying to do was to show up with enough force that he meant business. Stop killing the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So former German General Harold Kujat, who I've quoted many times, and many other military experts said that by that number you could actually deduce that the aim was exactly to liberate Russian-speaking areas, not anything more than that. It was never meant to be a full-fledged war or even to take over the Ukraine. Putin only showed up with enough soldiers, he thought, in answer to the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Please save us from this Ukrainian shelling since 2014. So I think the Russian position is very clear, and they have expressed also that if there is a ceasefire and Western powers keep pouring weapons into the Ukraine during the ceasefire, it would just prolong the war. It would make more, I mean, every week, 6,000 more people dying, both Ukrainians and Russians, on the battlefield. And the Ukrainian situation is getting pretty close to absolute desperation because they don't have any more manpower to keep the front line covered. So I think the Russian position is they want to have a ceasefire, but only if these core issues are fulfilled. That's why they proposed that memorandum, which supposedly is now being worked on. Now, it's clear that the Europeans are not just trying to sabotage this peace initiative. They're still, even to this day, still trying to do what Napoleon tried to do, what Hitler tried to do, to break up Russia, which of course, war. The European nations, the coalition of the willing, have stated they're going to keep this war going if America pulls out. And it's probably one of the reasons why German Chancellor Merz has emerged as the spokesman for the hardcore war party. And so when you look at the question of the Taurus missiles, I mean, where does that stand? I mean, it's really a likely scenario that Merz would just keep pushing for providing these medium-range missiles that could strike deep from Ukraine into Russia, and that he would push to give those to the Ukrainians. Well, Merz has stated just a few days earlier that Zelensky can absolutely rely on him and Germany when he was asked that question. Then 2 days later he said, oh, it's not on the table as an actual problem, but in any case, we're not going to make these statements public anymore, because if we do, because it's not wise to inform your opponent of your plans. So that means, and he may have already prepared it, it may have been delivered already, who knows? These missiles may already have been delivered to the Ukraine. The Russians do not have the equivalency, at least as far as we know, of satellite coverage of the Ukraine that the United States has. And all those missiles that have been launched in the last 3 or 4 decades, weather satellites, satellites examining cosmic rays, satellites watching for asteroids. What about all the satellites that have camera gear that can read a license plate? You didn't hear too much about that. So that means, with what Merz has just recently said, and he may have prepared it, but Bundestag member Matthias Miersch, who's now the General Secretary of the Social Democratic Party, stated that the Social Democrats oppose delivering the Taurus because it would make Germany immediately a part of the war party. Hey, now there's a brilliant thinker. So in the Christian Democratic Union and the Socialists, there is clearly a different viewpoint, and these are the two parties that rule the Bundestag right now. And there was this conclusion of a German-British strategic agreement where they decided to construct new long-range missiles which have 4 times the range of the Taurus. And the range of the Taurus is 500 kilometers and therefore can reach Moscow. But the Kremlin, which is really the ultimate threat, is obviously in that range, but these new long-range missiles are supposedly having a range of 2,000 kilometers and can reach the Urals, where a lot of the Russian defense electronics, satellite stuff is controlled. Now, for Germany and Britain to start making those in this moment is clearly a sign that they don't have a peace plan, but they don't have a thinking neuron left in their brain. They don't have a peace plan for how to bring an end to this conflict. And part of any operating peace plan would also be, how are we going to reestablish normal relations with Russia if we have a peace plan where we've been killing their citizens? And you don't hear a word about that from anybody in the European Union. You know, it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. Till I think it was the McCoys that finally wiped out the Hatfields. But even if they were to come to a peace agreement between, and I might be wrong on that, even if they were to come to a peaceful agreement between them, there would have to be some kind of a peace agreement. There's the old Romeo and Juliet concept that a boy from the McCoys fell in love with a girl from the Hatfields, and hopefully that would bring peace between the families until the families kill them. I don't know if that's true. That's the story I heard. But I mean, are they aware? When I look at this European situation, I mean, are they unaware that the past sanction packages that they have done against Russia have failed to do anything to stop Russia? They've had a negative, in fact, it's had a very negative backfire effect on Europe. And secondly, rearmament. Is that really the future of Europe? And then the final point that they're trying to make is that Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and the whole crew of the Eurocrats, whose interests are they really serving? Who's pulling their strings? Merz, of course, was BlackRock's chief man in Europe for a couple of decades before he became Chancellor of Germany. So we know who's pulling Merz's strings. But von der Leyen is President of the European Union. Now, this 17th package of sanctions that Europe is now planning on against Russia is going to hurt European economies and countries much more than Russia, because it will further deprive Europe, Germany in particular, and other nations definitely from working with Russia. It will deprive them access to cheap gas and oil, which is was the immediate impact of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. And we know now that America did that. And cutting off that cheap gas to Germany and Eastern Europe to be replaced by another gas line that went from Norway to Germany, which is owned by Norway and the United States. And by United States, of course, I mean corporations within the United States who would have loved to see the Nord Stream blow up. If you study this stuff enough and try to get as honest a perspective on the whole matter as possible, just by, by a little distance, it begins to be so overwhelmingly obvious what is going on here. And then von der Leyen even now wants to make legislation passed throughout Europe forbidding the reopening of the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, this is self-inflicted disaster. Oh, something else is playing there. The German economy, the European economy in general, are in free fall. Bankruptcies are happening every day, especially in Germany. The small and the medium-sized factories, industries, every day or two, every 2 or 3 days, these kinds of firms, the small industrial firms in Germany, have to declare bankruptcy. And you can count on how long that's going to go on for. And Germany just confronted with another potential complete collapse of their economy. I mean, just a few years ago, I mean, the people in the whole world looked at Europe as a very successful model with a good social system, not the Anglo-American free market economy. But it started with Chancellor Erhard's social market economy. But with the emphasis on social, very well-established social system, health system, educational system, all of those things now being thrown out the window. And they're trying to blame immigration policies as a part of the problem. Germany now is trying to heavily reinforce border control between Germany and Austria. It's a little late. And so if Germany doesn't very quickly reverse course, the whole German model, which is an export-oriented model, is going to collapse, because putting all that money, which is artificially created in the old Hamar-Schacht model under Hitler, the money is now going where? Is the money going back into the German economy? Is the money going into German infrastructure? Is the money going in to develop further German productivity? No, it's going to a certain extent to the German military-industrial complex, with Rheinmetall and others making enormous profits, along with the rest of the war profiteers. But the war drive is not fast enough, so a lot of money goes to other countries producing weapons, to the United States, of course, to British, to Israel, to all kinds of countries. Because while Germany supplies Israel with certain artillery and weaponry to fight the enemy in Gaza, Hamas, Israel is getting computer-based technology to Germany to have Germany ready to fight Russia. Just madness. Just madness. So money, which is going to be the debt of the grandchildren now being born in Germany, I mean, from the standpoint of a physical economy, is just being thrown out the window and sunk in the ocean, or whatever you want to call it. It certainly does not help the well-being of the population in any stretch of the imagination. Now, a couple of things about Gaza, and then I also want to address something that was on Tucker Carlson regarding Christian persecution in Ukraine. Stuff I wait to hear on national news, but I don't. Yair Golan, who was head of the Israeli Democrat Party, he is. I mean, he's still head of the Israeli Democrat Party, has caused a storm of controversy in Israel now by telling the truth and sending the Israeli pro-genocide warrior leadership, as he called them, into orbit. Golan is a retired major general and former deputy chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. And the Democratic Party is a merger carried out in June of last year between the Labor and Meretz parties, which now holds 4 seats in the Israeli Knesset. In an interview with the Kan public broadcaster, Golan said that Israel is on the way to becoming a pariah state like South Africa was if we don't return to acting like a sane country. Then he added, a sane country does not fight against civilians. A sane country does not kill babies as a hobby. And a sane country does not give itself the aim of expelling populations. Now, I've quoted from Golan before when he was in the IDF. He's the head of the Israeli Democratic Party. To repeat myself, I want you to understand the level in Israeli society and government that this statement is coming from. He's the retired major general and former deputy chief of staff of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So let's take an American equivalent. Austin, the former Secretary of Defense and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Then he becomes Secretary of Defense. And then Golan is also the one who's coming out saying this. Israel is on the way to become a pariah state like South Africa was if we don't return to acting like a sane country. A sane country does not fight against civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, he said that, and does not give itself the aim of expelling population. Now imagine Austin, Secretary Austin, coming out and saying, we were wrong in supporting the killing of Palestinian babies as a hobby. We were wrong in supporting a nation that fights its own civilians. We were wrong in supporting a country that's trying to expel a population of over 1 million. Now imagine Austin saying that about the Biden administration and the current Trump administration. That's kind of what just happened in Israel with Golan. So after slamming Israel's conduct of the war in the Gaza Strip, in an appearance on this Kan's This Morning program, Golan said, this government, the Netanyahu government, is full of vindictive, unintelligent, and immoral characters. And then he added that its conduct is far from Judaism, despite the fact that many of the coalition parties are religious. He said, these ministers are simply horrifying. It cannot be that we, the Jewish people who have undergone persecutions and pogroms, turn into those who do this to others. He also pointedly said that the Israeli government is engaged in a war for survival purposes, not security. referring to the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is using the war to stay out of jail on the extent corruption charges, let alone the more serious charges that he may face in consequence of the war on Palestine as to wars or crimes against humanity. So after Golan made these comments, one would imagine that Netanyahu hit the roof and releasing a statement, I vehemently condemn the wild indictment from Yair Golan against our heroic soldiers and the state of Israel. Get this. I don't even know if I can get this out of my mouth. The IDF is the most moral army in the world. Despicable anti-Semitic blood libels against IDF soldiers. Not going to be tolerated. Other leaders of parties aligned with the war party may, other parties, there are several parties, political parties in Israel, several of the other parties aligned with the war party against Yair Golan. Golan's statements represents a growing willingness of Israelis and others to finally denounce out loud the Israeli leadership's indefensible organized killing. So when Netanyahu says the IDF is the most moral army in the world, I suspect that there was probably a flood on social media of all the little IDF babies and youngsters with bullet holes in their skulls. Not shrapnel holes. You can tell the difference if a baby was near an exploding bomb. No. If the bomb exploding near a baby or a child macerated them with shrapnel, several pieces penetrating the skull, you can tell by the size of the hole, the shape and size of the hole in the baby's skull, whether it was a piece of shrapnel or whether it was a bullet. Now, these Doctors Without Borders have pretty well been kicked out of that area. And then there's other medical groups like Doctors Without Borders that have been there. And the name of the most prominent one that slipped my mind at the moment, see if I can remember it here, was showing pictures that people had taken on their cell phones and uploading them of these children with round holes in their skulls, not shrapnel holes, which means they had to have been targeted by a sniper. And so when Netanyahu says the IDF is the most moral army in the world, so adding to that, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher said on the BBC just this weekend, on the BBC radio, 14,000 babies in Gaza will die in the next 48 hours. Oh, my goodness. How do you define a baby? Up to a year old or up to when they're walking? When they start walking, are they no longer a baby but a toddler? This is the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. You think he might know what he's talking about. And the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, together on the BBC this weekend, that 14,000 babies in Gaza could die in the next 48 hours, 24 of which have already gone by. So when the show's host, Anna Foster, remarked that 14,000, and this is what she says, well, that's an extraordinary figure. Fletcher immediately responded, that is an utterly chilling figure. So when she asked how the UN arrived at the figure of 14,000, he said, we have strong teams on the ground, and of course, many of them have been killed. We still have lots of people on the ground, and they're at the medical centers, they're at the schools, trying to assess needs. But this is what we do, and we keep going. It'll be frustrating. We will be impeded. We run huge risks. But I don't see a better idea than getting that baby food into them. He said we need to flood the Gaza Strip with humanitarian aid. So while the UN has officially gotten permission from Israel for 100 trucks of humanitarian aid to enter Gaza this weekend. No, it was the end of last week. An amount 80% below the normal day's arrival prior to October 7th, 2023. It is likely that Israel is slow walking the entry over 2 to 3 days, even though hundreds and hundreds of trucks full of aid have been at the entry points of Gaza for weeks. And yesterday, Israel approved only 9 trucks, and then they only let 5 of them go through. Now, how long does it take to examine an emergency humanitarian vehicle from the UN to make sure it's not carrying armament and weapons and bullets and whatever else for Hamas? They have hundreds of these trucks. They said, we'll let 9 go through. This is at the end of last week, but only 5 did. And if you've seen any of the horrifying video of how many Palestinians are besieging those trucks, because they're all starving. It's not just the babies. That seems to pull at people's heartstrings more than the elderly, the aged, the infirmed, the non-combative. So UN Deputy Spokesperson for the Humanitarian Affairs, Jens Lerke, in a Geneva press briefing, I think Friday, said, "We have requested and received approval for more trucks to enter today, many more than were approved yesterday. Asked to specify how many, he said around 100. We expect, of course, with that approval, many of them hopefully will get to cross today at a point where they can be picked up and get further into the Gaza Strip for distribution." Fletcher acknowledged the extra problem that whenever trucks do make it through, they become targets of Israeli airstrikes. So the uncertain situation, along with Israel's new order for the population of Khan Yunis to move south, adds to further logistical problems. And getting such grossly inadequate amounts of food and medicine into Gaza, what is likely to amount to no more than 10% of the pre-October 7th, 2023 levels, is coherent with the policy to keep them at starvation levels enunciated at the May 18th, a week ago Sunday, Israeli cabinet meeting. It also coheres with the statement by Foreign Ministry Oren Mamerstein, who said that dozens of trucks per day was their goal, and the more pessimistic formulation by the Foreign Ministry Director, General Eden Bar Tal, said, "In the coming days, Israel will facilitate the entry of dozens of aid trucks. By any stretch, it'll take 3 to 6 days to reach 100 aid trucks, supposedly for 2 million Palestinians in Gaza." But it was too much for National Security Minister Ben Gvir, who complained about letting these trucks into the Gaza. This is a serious mistake, which is delaying our victory. I call once again on the Prime Minister to explain to our friends in the White House the implications of this aid, which only prolongs the war and delays our victory and the return of all of our hostages. They keep talking about return of all of our hostages. remember when back in 2003, when they were trying to propagandize the American public into supporting the coming war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq and being able to destroy all those horrible weapons of mass destruction that the Iraqis had. And when the war began, and maybe it goes back to George Sr. and his war with coming out of Kuwait into Iraq. But remember they had the playing cards? And on the playing cards, like the Ace of Spades, Osama bin Laden, of course, but different face cards would represent different leaders of the opposing force. And, jeez, the propaganda how easy it is with gimmicks like that to dissuade non-thinking, non-critical thinking, non-research oriented people in our country who will believe what some authority figure says because of the heavy weight in this country we give to authoritarianism. If they're in a position of authority, we just assume that they're telling the truth or that what they're saying is the best thing for us. And so they start having these playing cards that identify how bad people are, you know, whether they're aces or kings or queens or jacks or tens or all the way down to the two of diamonds. I was wondering, the thought crossed my mind, I wonder if the Israeli government and AIPAC and the ADF and all of the Israeli lobbyists in Washington, D.C. have a set of playing cards of the American politicians that aren't the enemy, the politicians that they need to continue the horror of Gaza. And I kind of wonder if President Trump was the ace of spades. Yeah, I said that. I said that. All right, a couple of other things. I've got a different audience now than I had at the beginning. The Memorial Day 15% sale on our products goes on until midnight tonight. You just go to Amazon, or don't go to Amazon, it's too expensive there. You go to forbiddendoctor.com and take advantage of this 15% off. You will not find cheaper prices for standard process anywhere, I guarantee it. And also Forbidden Doctor's products, the long life energy enzymes, and the ageless thyroid. I had an experience the other night with the energy enzymes. Something hit me Thursday, and I could feel it Friday while I was taking care of patients. And then Saturday, I woke up, I hardly was able to breathe. Got a little bit better yesterday, or Sunday, and then a little bit better yesterday. But I gave up the show yesterday morning because I probably couldn't get through it. I'm surprised I got through this morning. But sometime Saturday, I mean, I was wheezing like a 50-year-old Electrolux floor vacuum cleaner. And it frightened me. I'm thinking, I don't want to go to Instacare. I don't want to go to the emergency room. There's enough people walking around with oxygen tanks, I could just, take one of them. I didn't want to do that. And I saw my bottle of long life energy enzymes sitting there on the counter that I usually use for digestive support. If I overeat, then several of those take away the problem. I thought, I wonder what would happen if I took 9 of those enzymes. This is the honest truth. I took 9 of my own long life energy enzymes. In 20 minutes, I could breathe freely. Why? I don't know. Was something going on digestively that was triggering some kind of a protein allergy response in the gut that had some component with the lungs? Was there something going on in my bloodstream that was causing some bronchial spasm or congestion, as one might expect with asthma? I don't know. But I took 9 of those and then just sat. I had a blanket over me, just sat still on the couch, watching some movie on YouTube. I don't remember what it was. And I noticed within 20 minutes I could take a full breath without any wheezing. And from that moment on, I started improving. That's also with a 15% discount now. You go to, and there's no code. You don't need to worry about a code. Just go order. It's automatic, 15% deduction or reduction. And then the same thing for ageless thyroid. Our product for being able to handle stress. Because it's, you know, the old adage that stress is a killer, boy, is really true. And stress just burns out your adrenals. And so we didn't call it ageless adrenal. We called it ageless thyroid because people are more familiar with hyper or hypothyroid problems, not so much hyper or hypoadrenal problems. But it supports the adrenal glands every bit as much as it does the thyroid. That's also 15% deduction. Discount, not deduction, a discount. Then this emergency case I took care of that flew in from Georgia a couple of weeks ago is systemic pain from skull to the knees and muscle spasms and just, I want to get out of here, I don't want to live any longer kind of pain response. Now's doing fantastic. I only worked on him once. I've only had time to work on them once. They were just here, I took care of them, and then they went back to Georgia. But free of pain, years and years of pain. Was involved with high school drill, cheerleading, and some soccer as well as gymnastics. Just pound the spine a little bit. A very lovely human being. She says, I got my life back. Then there's another lady I took care of last week, I'll be seeing today, that hurt their back, oh, good gracious, 30, 40 years ago. And it comes and goes and comes and goes, and they've learned to live with it. Except whenever it comes, it stays longer before it goes, and it hurts worse. And it hits about once every couple of years and lays them up for a couple of weeks. Has known about me and what I do for 20 years and finally decided to come in. Now, after about 35 years, she can finally stand up straight. I think I've worked on her twice. Then there's another fellow who, I don't know if you're familiar with the pickle procedure, something they do over in Denver. It's very invasive, very painful to strengthen the ligaments of the neck. And the people that do this pickle procedure tell their patients after the pickle procedure is done to go see a NUCA doctor to finish it. And so this person who lives in Layton, who doesn't listen to the radio, completely unfamiliar with us, my clinic, goes over to Denver to have this procedure done, and then is told, go see Dr. Stockwell in Salt Lake City when you get back home. So I saw him, and it's one of those situations where no matter what position you put your head or neck, it feels like your head's going to fall off. And it feels like the top bone is sliding forward on the second bone, ready to just the head to fall off the body into the lap. I've never felt that. I mean, I've had some neck issues from accidents, high school football, other things, car accidents growing up. Never felt anything like that. But that's what he came in complaining of. And now is just remarking about how much more stable his head feels on top of his neck. Now, I'm trying to work out a way in which I can take care of everybody that wants to be taken care of. We're in discussions on how we're going to do that. But consultations are free. Doesn't cost anything to come in and sit down with me for a half an hour and talk about what's going on. You want me to take care of you, then there will be a charge at that point. But if you don't want me to take care of you, or it looks like what's going on with you is not in our scope of practice, we can still be friends, send you on your way at no charge. But you have to schedule it through the office at 801-523-1890. 801-523-1890. All right, now in the 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes remaining, the United States, not only is the United States financing the genocide in Gaza, we are financing the persecution of Christians in the Ukraine. Now, I got this from RT, referring to a show that was on Tucker Carlson. And very few Americans understand the degree to which Kyiv oppresses the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is an extension, of course, of the Russian Orthodox. So the U.S. is essentially facilitating the persecution of Christians in the Ukraine by supporting the Kyiv government, which has been waging a purge campaign against the nation's canonical Orthodox Church, according to Tucker Carlson. And he made this statement during an interview with a former Ukrainian member of parliament, Vadim Novinsky, that was released just this last Friday. And Carlson said this: "Every day the churches and the temples are seized by soldiers with machine guns who come in, throw out the priests, beat the believers, children, old people, women. And it's happening all over the Ukraine." He said, "I think very few Americans understand the degree to which the Ukrainian government under Zelensky has persecuted the Ukrainian Orthodox Church." So Carlson then asked Novinsky what he would say to the American lawmakers who nevertheless have approved financial aid to continue to Kyiv. He said, "The Speaker of the House of the United States Congress is a man who describes himself as a Christian, and yet he pays for this," of course referring to Mike Johnson. So the former Ukrainian member of parliament replied that he would like to see the U.S. aid going directly to ordinary Ukrainians, not the authorities, because the Ukrainian citizens and the Ukrainian authorities live in parallel realities. So the U.S. government agencies appropriated a total of $182 billion on various forms of assistance to Kyiv from 2022 to the end of 2024, according to Ukraine Oversight. Last week, Trump said he was concerned that billions of dollars are being wasted on aid to the Ukraine. He said Congress was very upset about it and that lawmakers were asking, "Where's all the money going? Show me the money." Kyiv has accused the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of maintaining ties to Russia, even though it declared its independence from the Moscow Patriarch in May of 2022. And the crackdown has included numerous arrests of clergymen and church raids, one of the most notorious which took place in the catacombs of the Kyiv Peshursk Lavra, where the holy relics are kept. So last year, Zelensky signed legislation allowing the state to ban religious organizations affiliated with governments that Kyiv deems aggressors, effectively are targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Earlier this week, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Moscow would not abandon the Orthodox believers in Ukraine and vowed to make sure that their lawful rights would be respected. I wonder, I think there's a temple there's an LDS temple in Kyiv, isn't there? Oh, I'm almost positive of that. I wonder if it's getting any trouble. But then you know how the LDS church position on sustaining the government in which that church is found, which was part of the conflict in World War II of German members of the LDS Church fighting against American or British members of the LDS Church under the Allies versus the Axis powers. Now you've got the church rather heavily established well, I don't know heavily, but a growing membership of the LDS Church in Russia. And a growing number, I remember when missionaries were allowed in Russia over 20 some years ago. And there's still LDS, last I heard, LDS missionaries being sent to Russia, as well as the Ukraine. They just stay in the safer areas. But you're going to end up with Russians who become members of the LDS Church, who are volunteering to go fight in a war, fighting against Ukrainian members of the LDS Church. Just madness, just absolute madness. So I wonder if the LDS Church is getting any more trouble. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, of course, is formerly an extension of the Russian Orthodox, even though they declared their independence 3 years ago. I don't know. It's just, I don't know. All right, tomorrow I do a health show, and some of the, I've been talking about the COVID vaccine endlessly. Some of the latest stuff, some of the latest research finally making it into the open news of the disastrous nature of those vaccines. And then I still get comments from those who got it. Well, nothing happened to me. Well, hopefully nothing does happen to you. Just don't get another one. I'm going to talk about that, and I'll talk about some other things of a nutrition nature, because I heard some crazy nutrition advice this morning. It looks like we're done at K-Talk. So those of you on the stream, thank you for your attention and being a part of the program. I just, again, ask you to like and subscribe. I hope this was, I'm still a little bit weak because of something that hit me a couple of days ago, but I'm recovering quickly. And my green screen is supposed to be delivered this week. So I will be able to try it out here and see if I can stop this flashing stuff with my head, because obviously we need to do something about that. So thanks. I'm going to end the stream. Thank you for your comments. Sharmark, Osman, I appreciate that very much. I appreciate your listenership. And I will see you all tomorrow.